This is our 5th Marcus Garvey seminar. It also is the final Caribbean law class where we have invitees. We're going to have special introduction for Nyala Harrison, who's to my right, the leader point, so I'm not going to rain on that parade. I'd like to especially welcome Alex Britell, the editor of the Caribbean Journal, and well, my colleague David Brown has just stepped out, member of the Florida Bar and graduate. And thank you everybody who's not in the class today. Thanks for coming. At this point, I would like to welcome Ms. Aurelian, who's going to give us a introduction, a presentation on Marcus Garvey's involvement with the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Marcus Garvey is a national hero of Jamaica, but he's not very well known, or he's not as well known as he should be in the United States. And one of the products of this seminar is that Mr. Garvey's philosophy and his contribution to modern political and legal thought can be better known. Mr. Emma, did we sit there to see the presentation? We got block the camera.
Jewel, could you check that it takes it right there? I mean, I don't believe it will. But I think so. You're not Will Chamberlain.
Standing up there.
No, we won't.
Block?
Perfect. Chairman, do you mind doing the lights?
The Universal Negro Improvement Association and African Communities League, which I just refer to as UNIA throughout the presentation. As well as the Harlem Renaissance, which I'll address a bit toward the end because there was an interesting dynamic between the UNIA and the Harlem Renaissance, as well as WEB as well. Okay, so the UNIA was founded on August 1st, 1914 by the Honorable Marcus Garvey in Jamaica. When he moved to the United States, the UNIA founded a branch. He founded a branch in New York in 1917 with only 13 members. What's fairly startling is after only 3 months, the membership went from 13 to 3,500. And ultimately, the UNIA became the largest mass movement of African Americans in U.S. history, with a membership of several hundred thousand. By 1920, there were over 1,900 divisions in more than 40 countries throughout the world. And as part of the UNIA was also to establish new auxiliary components, different types of businesses that would support the mission of the UNIA. preamble, motto, and mission statement of the UNIA, and it still stands today. Nothing has really changed. It's still referred to as a social, friendly, humanitarian, charitable, educational, institutional, constructive, spiritually governing, ruling body, and it's founded by persons desiring to work for the general upliftment of the Negro peoples of the world. The motto is one God, one aim, one destiny. And that's basically very illustrative of the whole, of Marcus Garvey's plan for this organization was to unite black peoples of the world, regardless of whether they were from, you know, the motherland Africa, the Caribbean, or in America. So some of the principles of the UNIA, he preached the doctrine of self-help, unity, pride, and equality. Sought to uplift the African race by making Africans economically independent, unifying worldwide African communities through communication and economic ties. He promoted black people's rights to political self-determination and the founding of a black nation on the continent of Africa. Marcus Garvey believed that the only way for blacks to improve their condition was to unify, and to unify worldwide. This is one of my favorite quotes. A people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. And essentially, Marcus Garvey's movement with the UNIA really helped to establish that, as you will see. This was the Universal African Flag, and it was first unveiled on August 13, 1920 at the first International Convention. So this is an organization that began in the United States in 1917, and 3 years later there's like this massive international convention of all the UNIA divisions across the world. And the flag was meant to represent the collective African people. We still see this flag flown today in different events. The red symbolized the color of blood which men must shed for their redemption and liberty. The black was the color of the noble and distinguished race to which African people belong. And the green is the luxuriant vegetation of the motherland. And the reason for this flag came from a song a few years earlier that said, well, Marcus Garvey declared basically, said, show me the race of a nation without a flag, and I will show you a race of people without any pride. Aye, in song and in mimicry they have pride. Every race has a flag but the Coon. How true. But that was said of us 4 years ago. They can't say it now. This was a song that was just, derogatory towards black people and saying that we couldn't be a race because black people didn't have a flag. So Marcus Garvey inaugurated this flag basically to represent the black race of the people. Part of the UNIA was a lot of ventures, and the purpose of the ventures were to form an economic base in the communities. Part of his belief was that black people should be self-sustained and have their own economic independence. So the UNIA not only preached that, they actually went ahead and established ventures throughout. Some of the more popular were the Negro World newspaper, the Black Star Line, and the Negro Factories Corporation. So the Negro World was founded in August 17, 1918. It's a weekly newspaper that expressed the ideas of the UNIA. Garvey wrote a weekly front page editorial to highlight the position on relevant topics of the day. Printed in several languages, it was distributed, worldwide throughout the UNIA divisions. That was especially interesting is that his wife, Amy Jacks Garvey, had a section specifically for women entitled "Are Women and What They Think?" It reached a circulation of over 500,000. Publication ceased in 1933, so it lasted well beyond the time that Marcus Garvey was in the States. And of course, notable authors. This was the flagship of the UNIA, the Black Star Line, and it was the largest endeavor of the UNIA enterprise. And it was intended for two reasons: as a way for Americans to return to Africa, but also as a way to move goods between the black people living in the United States and the Caribbean, and that was the goal. So it was incorporated in 1919, and the Black Star Line stocks were sold at UNIA conventions at $5 each, only to UNIA members, in keeping with blacks should own their own economic enterprises. So they purchased their first ship only 3 months after incorporation, and they did spend 3 years traveling between the United States and the West Indies, It served more as a cargo ship, bringing goods back and forth. It was not financially successful because of poorly conditioned ships. They purchased old, like warships, that were really in need of repair. And there were a lot of sabotage by J. Edgar Hoover and the corruption of the management. Notable here, though, is that, in keeping with Marcus Garvey's viewpoint, is he had an all-black crew and a black captain, which for this time was practically unheard of. But it was regarded, even though it didn't last very long because of all the issues that they had, but it was regarded as a considerable accomplishment for African Americans at the time, and it ceased sailing only 3 years later in 1922. The Negro Factories Corporation was another. There was a lot of different ventures, but these I think were the three most prominent. The Negro Factories Corporation, that was also incorporated in 1920, so just a year after the Black Star Line. And these included shops, just restaurants, laundries, dressmaking shops, and they had a very big presence wherever there was a division, especially in Harlem. So in Harlem, they had several hundred employees, and all of these businesses were all either black-owned businesses that they themselves built and developed, or they sponsored or helped other people to build their own businesses. And it was meant to serve the black community as a way for the black community to have their products sold, and they also supported businesses that employed black people. I thought that was pretty interesting too. So the UNIA today still exists. This is Cleocephas Miller. He's the president now. He's been the president of the UNIA since 1989. The members are known as Garveyites. Their current newsletter is Post-Colonial Nubian Trailblazer, and they still maintain the same motto and philosophy that Marcus Garvey started the organization with, we're almost 100 years ago. Nothing's really changed much with that. Obviously, the membership is a lot smaller, it's not as popular. I'm moving on to the Harlem Renaissance. Cotton Club. Okay. All right, so the Harlem Renaissance is, in keeping with the theme of Marcus Garvey, I think it was the right time for a message that Marcus Garvey was preaching. Harlem Renaissance spanned from 1919 to the early 1930s, and it was known as the first cultural emergence of African Americans. I mean, basically this was black people being seen as, instead of just Jim Crow South black person or a slave, they were now being seen as artists and musicians, authors, really coming into their own right. And so it represented the rebirth, right, Renaissance of the Negro slave. And also notable during this time is blacks living in the South migrated north by the hundreds of thousands, particularly in Harlem. You had over 200,000 black people living in probably, 1 square mile at the beginning of the Harlem Renaissance. So the difference between the traditional thoughts espoused during the Harlem Renaissance and Garveyism, Garvey chose to launch the UNIA in Harlem because so many blacks from the Caribbean were already living there. So he already had a comfort zone, and he had already started the UNIA in Jamaica, so it was known of it. During the 1920s, as the growth of racial pride among African Americans was greatly stimulated by Marcus Garvey, especially among poor African Americans. And remember, it's a large group of people really trying to find their way and trying to build a new society, and having come from the South to the North. However, the black middle class did not universally receive Garvey, the UNIA approach. Organizations like the NAACP wanted to have an integrated society and advocated for the acceptance of African Americans into white society. Marcus Garvey advocated for an independent black society. He did not seek the acceptance or approval of white society. I think the goals ultimately were the same. It's just how to get there was very different. But Garvey definitely, I think both organizations fostered black nationalism, but it's just a different path of reaching the same goal. And the most notable person at the time that stood in stark contrast to Garvey was W.E.B. Du Bois. And in The Souls of Black Folk, the popular line is the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. And he is one of the most influential intellectuals of the 20th century. Many accolades. He rejected the accommodationist methods, and he pressed for public protest against racial violence and discrimination, again, keeping with the theme of wanting to be able to integrate and integrate fairly. He's notable for his advocacy of the development of an intellectual elite known as the talented 10. So he felt that the top 10% of the society, being in terms of education, class, background, these were the people who should lead the black race. He founded the Niagara movement, which later became an additional organization, the NAACP, which still is, in 1910. He also supported the ideas, just like Marcus Garvey, of economic nationalism, Pan-Africanism, and the preservation of black cultural heritage. I mean, to say that they didn't get along is like really an understatement. They really didn't get along. But I had a difficult time trying to figure out what's that much of a difference. The biggest difference is he preached more in terms of integration, integrating into white society, whereas Garvey was more about separatism. And a lot of the research I found said that he was considered to be cultured and educated. He was the first African American to receive a doctorate from Harvard. Garvey was also a very educated man. The son of a stonemason from Jamaica, very educated, but he's not seen as, he's seen more as the leader of the masses. They both founded newspapers. We brought the Crisis, which still exists with the NAACP. And it's interesting, in the early years of the newspaper, there was an all-white staff at the Crisis, whereas the Negro World it had an all-black staff. And Garvey used that as propaganda constantly against Du Bois. Du Bois became suspicious of the Black Star Line, and he was one of the people that published an expose, basically crying foul about all the corruption and things that were going on in the Black Star Line, and he published that article in the Crisis magazine or newspaper. So this whole argument became personal, and it's unfortunate. So Du Bois called Garvey the most dangerous enemy of the Negro race. He's either a lunatic or a traitor. And in so much places in the research, two great minds and two great leaders of black nationalism, and it comes down to, he describes Garvey as a little fat black man, ugly with a big head. And this is, it just doesn't seem like you're talking about someone who's supposed to be this massive intellectual of the 20th century to like, it's what it's going to resolve to. But Garvey, of course, didn't take that very well, and he returns. I found it to be very childish at one point, but it's interesting. He describes him as a little Dutch, a little French, a little Negro, a mulatto, why in fact he's a monstrosity. So that's how bad it got. So who influenced who? Du Bois increasingly, to me, evolved into Garvey. I think Garvey's message resonated loudly with Du Bois, and I think that's what stuck. And it's very ironic what happens at the end. So after Du Bois visited Africa in the 1920s, he believed that Negroes are to lead in the rise out of Africa. So the words on the front page of the Negro World on one of the first editions was, "Will black people allow white people to rule Africa like it's our job to do?" And they're saying the same exact thing in their different papers. Du Bois organized the Pan-African Congresses worldwide to develop African affairs, very similar to the UNIA. He began to embrace a Marxist analysis of black labor in the United States, and he advocated for a nation within a nation, a form of black economic separatism or cooperation, similar, actually identical, to Garvey's call for black economic independence. Du Bois became increasingly radical. He was dismissed from the NAACP, and of course the government began to harass him, just like they did with Garvey. He was indicted under the Foreign Agents Registration Act of 1938. Though he was acquitted, the U.S. government refused to give him a passport, so he couldn't leave the country for several years. The difference here is that he's an American, so he couldn't be deported, whereas Garvey ultimately was deported for his indictment. Du Bois eventually just joined the Communist Party, and I thought what was interesting is in 1961, it was Du Bois who actually moved back to Africa and renounced his U.S. citizenship and became a Ghanaian citizen and lived there until he died.
Thank you very much, Ms. O'Neill, for an excellent presentation. I'll now ask Ms. Kulo to give us her presentation on Garvey's trial and problems with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Thank you very much, Ms. Kulo.
Thank you.
Yes, I'm going to be presenting on Marcus Garvey's trial and his deportation. And I'll try not to be redundant because Katir mentioned some stuff that I will end up covering. Okay, just to begin, Marcus Garvey, he was born in St. Anne's Bay in Jamaica on August 17th, 1887. He was the youngest of 11 children, but actually one of only 2 children actually survived to adulthood. From a young age, he demonstrated kind of a radical way of thinking, and even when he was 14, he left school and became a printer's apprentice, where he led a strike for higher wages, which is in South Africa. From 1910 to 1912, he traveled in South and Central America for work, and then he visited London. And that's where some of his ideas began to really develop. Kind of what Peter already mentioned. He founded the Universal Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, in 1914. And he moved to Harlem and began working with the UNIA, and it was really successful under his leadership. He was a wonderful public speaker, and he used that gift of just speaking well to gain thousands and thousands of followers. Some estimates of it. At his peak, he had millions of followers. He preached a message of black nationalism and a return to Africa, and it was called Garveyism, of course. And he believed Africa was really home for blacks. And as part of this fascination with the return to Africa, he founded the Black Star Line in 1919. And this was to provide transportation of African Americans or blacks in general to Africa. And he also founded the Negro Factories Corporation. This was to encourage black economic independence, which he thought was fundamental in terms of just securing a complete freedom. He has successfully tried to persuade the government of Liberia and West Africa to grant land on which black people from America could settle. Obviously that changed and they were able to settle there later. As his views became more popular, he actually grew in controversy, and this was because many politicians, white politicians, they saw his views as irrational and incendiary. A lot of the statements he made, they interpreted them as inciting resentment. As Katir mentioned, he was also unpopular with some black leaders. They found issues with his message. Like we discussed, he kind of had a separatist philosophy in contrast to kind of more integrationalist ideas, and they didn't agree with that. Most notably, Dubois, he said that Garvey was the most dangerous enemy of the Negro race in America. They really didn't like his approach, and like we noted, Dubois actually went after him in personal ways. The Black Star Line and the Back to Africa movement was unique in that it advanced a Pan-African philosophy, and it wanted to inspire the global mass movement and black economic empowerment. But, like I said, it was very unpopular because of its separatist agenda. The Black Star Line is actually what led to his trial and deportation, but we'll get into that. Okay, just these are the main ways that I found that the government and FBI worked towards Garvey's demise. It wasn't called the FBI then, it was the Bureau of Investigation, but now it's known as the FBI. It was the result of persistent efforts by the U.S. government to prosecute him with the goal of deportation. We'll discuss that further. They really kind of went after him unjustly in many people's views, simply because they saw him as a threat to the establishment. Also, what led to his deportation and his trial was the UNIA's own mistakes and mismanagement. There are a lot of just irresponsible record keeping and things of that nature, and people not really working up to potential within the organization, and that really didn't help the public perception, especially among other blacks, about Marcus Garvey. And like I mentioned, the African community was also really opposed to him, and some sectors were really opposed to him. Okay, the Black Star Line. The Black Star Line was initially successful, moderately successful its first year, but the next 2 years it really started to rapidly decline, and like I mentioned, kind of with the UNIA, it was due to incompetent workers, poor record keeping, and mechanical breakdowns with the ships because, as Katir mentioned, they were old and not properly maintained. Okay. J. Edgar Hoover, who was the special assistant to the Attorney General and the head of the General Intelligence Division of the Bureau of Investigation, which is now known as the FBI, he really feared Garvey in a sense, and he began this investigation and this movement to find anything they could against him and get him out of the country, essentially. And this is a quote from him. He said, "Unfortunately, however, he, Marcus Garvey, has not as yet violated any federal law whereby he could be proceeded against on the grounds of being an undesirable alien from the point of view of deportation." So that kind of revealed what was going on in his head. They really didn't have anything on him in terms of wrongdoing, but they were going to look for anything they could to really just get him out of their hair. Okay, and the way they found was through the Black Star Line.
Sorry.
Okay. Hoover's words, like I said, reflected a growing conspiracy to force Garvey out of the U.S. And around November of 1919, the FBI officially began an investigation into Garvey and the UNIA. They hired James Edward Amos, Arthur Lowell Brannett, Thomas Leon Jefferson, and others, and their sole task was just to find a reason they could bring charges against Garvey. Edwin Kilrow, who was an assistant district attorney in the district attorney's office in New York, he began an investigation, and he couldn't find any direct evidence, and they used really just strange ways even of trying to target Garvey. They tried to use the Mann Act, which was a law at the time, which was against prostitution and immorality, because Marcus Garvey was apparently involved in an affair with a woman who was not his wife while he was still married to Amy Ashworth. So they tried that, but that was unsuccessful. So Garvey was basically summoned to Kilrow's office, I guess, for questioning, and he obviously was beginning to catch on that they were targeting him, and so he wrote an editorial in the Negro World, which was his publication, and then he was arrested and indicted for criminal libel. So this was just even another attempt at them trying to bring anything they could against him. They were dismissed, and Garvey issued a retraction of his statements. This was really, I guess, really interesting and crazy. A man named George Tyler, he actually confronted Garvey in his office on October 13th, the same year, 1919. And he told him, allegedly, that Kilrow had told him to get Harvey, and then he shot him, but he only wounded him in his right leg and his scalp. He survived, obviously. And Tyler was arrested, and then he committed suicide. So this adds to the, belief that they were really going after him, even to the point that they wanted to kill him. Originally, like I said, they wanted to kind of get him deported, but they couldn't do that legitimately, so they found a charge of mail fraud to bring against him, and this was in relation to the Black Star Line. And the U.S. Post Office and the Attorney General were working together to find these evidence they could bring against him. When the trial records were really analyzed, it showed that there are many inconsistencies in the way that the prosecution handled the case, and even an objective viewer could see that it wasn't fair and with accordance with the rule of law. But like I mentioned before, Garvey's not his own personal, but the people who worked alongside him, their own mismanagement of the UNIA and the Black Star Line kind of helped the case against him, because they didn't keep proper bookkeeping, so it was hard for them to refute a lot of the accusations that were made against them. And what this charge really came down to was they just weren't going through proper procedures when they were running the line, and it wasn't criminal or deviant, but they were able to succeed on the charges because they couldn't prove that they were innocent, totally innocent. Apparently, there was a ship, and they were going to name it Phyllis Wheatley. She's a well-known black figure, but they hadn't really bought the ship and got the rights to name it that, but they were calling it that on the brochures and showing an image of a ship that was actually named Orion. So this was fraudulent in a sense. Garvey represented himself in his trial, and this didn't help either. He was intelligent, like mentioned, but it usually isn't a good idea to represent yourself at any time. And at the time, because he wasn't popular with a certain sex of African Americans, it was hard for him to gain kind of enough public support to really rally behind him. He had turned off a lot of black socialist and communist movements because he had met with the leader of the Ku Klux Klan, and this really turned them off. And he'd also just mismanaged money that people had contributed to him, so this really just turned them off. So they really weren't rallying behind him, and they kind of, because of even Dubois' article published about the Black Star Line, they believed the charges. Okay, this is the trial. They produced as evidence an empty envelope which contained the misleading brochure. They actually didn't have a copy for the trial. And they had a man named Benny Dancy testify that he didn't remember what was in the envelope, even though he had regularly received the brochures. They also had another witness, Cargill, and he perjured himself because he ended up admitting accidentally that he was told to mention certain dates in his testimony by the chief prosecutor, who was Maxwell Maddox. He also, just during interrogation, revealed other things that didn't, that showed that it was kind of the prosecution was kind of being shady. He was told to lie, apparently, by the postal inspector, F.H. I don't know how they got all this information out of him during interrogation, but they were able to. So he ended up perjuring himself, but the charges still succeeded. They also told him to lie and state that he mailed letters containing the purportedly fraudulent brochures. Like I said, in the first year of operation, the Black Star Line was moderately successful, and they did actually own ships. And they were negotiating at the time to get the Phyllis Wheatley ship. It was just kind of like a mishap that it ended up being a short deal. They actually haven't had to secure that deal yet. So, of course, Marcus Garvey was convicted on June 23rd, 1923, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. 4 people were actually charged in the UNIA, but he was the only one who was found guilty, kind of also adding to the belief that he was unfairly targeted. Many of his supporters obviously saw the trial as fraudulent, and but like I said, kind of the accounting irregularities didn't help their case. Okay. Following his conviction, he appealed, but it was denied, and he was deported upon release from prison. Many of his supporters obviously thought it was politically motivated and miscarriage of justice and a violation of the rule of law. Garvey returned to Jamaica after being deported, and he continued to work there, and then he moved to London in 1935, and he continued with the same line of political work that he had, but it was never as successful because he was a charismatic leader, and under his leadership in Harlem, they were very successful. What after the kind of the sting of the trial and the deportation, kind of everything went being kind of, just not in sync, it was kind of impossible for him to kind of reach that same level of success. He died in London after suffering 2 strokes. He had 1 stroke, and then shortly after had another one, and died from the second one. His remains were brought back to Jamaica in 1964, and of course he was named Jamaica's first national hero. And his message of black empowerment, black nationalism, self-determination, all that can still be seen. I mean, it was obviously huge inspiration at the time, but even today, many cite the works of Marcus Garvey as influencing their own ideology.
Is that a picture of this now?
That's actually that's not his actual funeral, but it's kind of a memorial afterwards.
In London?
In London, yeah. But in 2010, I guess members of the UNIA today actually petitioned President Barack Obama to pardon him on those charges, but he refused to because he said basically he's been dead for ages and it wasn't relevant anymore. And they were really upset about that because they felt like just the symbolism of it would be important. This was when I was in Jamaica in 2010. I don't remember what this building was. We were there. It's a government office. We were there to figure out something to do with a family member's pension. But this is a statue of Marcus Garvey.
National Hero, sir.
Okay. And this is a statement. We declare to the world Africa must be free. Kind of just memorializing him. Paying homage to him.
Thank you very much. Well, I remember when I came to school at the University of Miami in 1980, we only had 4 blacks in the school. 2 in the first year, I was one of the 2. Now it was very different just a few years ago. And to describe some of the issues that were relevant just about 30 years ago, we'll ask Mr. Neff to talk about Garveyism and the McDuffie riots. Mr. Neff.
Hey Jason, I sent you a
I got it.
I'm very happy.
You're good to go.
You're good to go.
Please do your PowerPoint.
Great.
Thank you very much, sir.
Not a problem.
I do not have the clicker. His AWOL.
Hello, everyone. Thank you. The title of my presentation is the 1980 McDuffie Riots, and it's more of an abstract idea with considering race in Miami and Garvey's theory of ethnocentric economic development. This might be a little bit kind of a heavy topic, but as I say, he's not heavy. He's my brother. Hey. All right. So firstly, I thought it was very important that we get a background conception of what Miami looked like at the time. So this is a breakdown of the statistics of Miami circa 1980. So we have approximately 1.6 million people in the metropolitan area, including Liberty City, which is actually the stage for the McDuffie riots, predominantly. And as you can see here, 77.6% are white, 46.4% non-Latin white, so Caucasian, and then 17.2% black, and then 5.2% other. So as you can probably gain from this point, if we were just going to go on the basis of a straight color ratio, we have very, very dominant Caucasian presence in the area, in which will actually lead to further problems down the line. So what are we talking about? We're talking about Liberty City. Liberty City, before current time, was the largest African-American neighborhood, and it was the cultural center of Miami for black people. It was a decently prosperous middle-class neighborhood. It was basically Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance of Miami. So when did it all start to go downhill? Initially, it starts to go downhill with the construction of I-95, which basically just went straight over Liberty City. This was seen as a complete affront by the majority to destroy the community, to put down black people, to effectively destroy what they had built, and to make matters kind of worse in a sense for Liberty City in recognition of economic issues is the Mariel boat lift of 1980. There was a mass influx of Cubans, and they would work for cheaper than the black population, and they were taking away jobs. This, all kind of put together, started to lead to poverty. We're talking urban decay, and we're increasing local tempers and frustrations over the entire economic situation. It also weakens the middle class, which further discussion will explain why that's bad. So who is Arthur McDuffie? So as you can see, this handsome gentleman is Mr. McDuffie. He was an insurance salesman and a veteran of war. He was a Marine, and he was a military policeman. On 17 December 1979, he was caught speeding on his motorcycle at 1:50 in the morning in Liberty City. The only reason why he didn't stop for the police was because he was afraid of getting arrested for a suspended license, and as we all know, then we start having the issue of recidivism, and then no able way to actually conduct your business, especially if you're an insurance salesman with no internet. It's very difficult to function that way. It's true. As I said, the original form of communications was ships. We went to motorcycles. Now we have email. Go figure. So effectively, he led the police on a high-speed chase for about 20 minutes, and clocking over 80 miles per hour. And eventually, he slowed down, realizing what the situation was, and he said, "Not that. I give up." So what then transpired was something completely unconscionable. He was handcuffed, he was choked out, pushed to the ground, and beaten severely by police. The beating lasted for over 20 minutes, and the policemen used nightsticks, batons, and flashlights. If anyone's ever had any type of experience with a mag light, just imagine what that can do to you. He was beaten so savagely that his skull was cracked in half, like an egg. And afterwards, in order to cover the tracks, the policeman put his helmet back on his head and then tried to allege that this was some kind of collision. So with the initial investigation, the coroner was smart. He said there is absolutely no way that these injuries could be sustained unless, at such high velocity, he fell off his motorcycle and bounced on his head 12 times. And witnesses who were there basically explained it, and I think very aptly, as a pack of wild dogs attacking a piece of meat.
But he died, right?
He died 4 days later after going into a coma from a serious head trauma. Did not have a chance. So the indictments. Officer Alex Moreno was charged for second-degree murder, and the reason was because he was the gentleman who allegedly took the final blows of the mag light to crack Mr. McDuffie's head in half. And then we also have the other officers. Sergeant Ira Driggs and Officer Michael Watts were indicted for manslaughter and aggravated battery for taking part in the beating. And officers Ubaldo del Toro and Sergeant Herbert Evans were considered to be accessories after the fact for trying to cover up everything. Later on, William Hanlon was supposed to be charged, but his testimony was thrown out by Judge Nesbitt due to Miranda violations. Nesbitt actually being a alumna of this institution. And what made things even more telling, in fact, was since 1973, Moreo, Diggs, Watts, and Hanlon have been cited for 47 citizen complaints and had 13 internal affairs investigations. So before the trial, black citizens marched upon the Metro Day building. Sorry. I'll just read that. Carrying a black coffin, a symbol of their disgust at the entire situation. And tempers flared throughout the black community because Mr. McDuffie did not even have a traditional type of character or criminal preference type that should have been profiled by the police. I found in an article, they killed the insurance man. The insurance man, I've heard of the police doing a lot of rotten things, but the insurance man, come on, had no prior criminal records, no drug charges, nothing like that. Model citizen. And so there was a request of change of venue to Tampa, and this was accepted because the judge decided she didn't want to have a time bomb go off in this courtroom or the community. So the trial is interesting. So the jury was comprised of 6 white guys. And Hanlon received immunity and admitted to choking down McDuffie to the ground with his nightstick before Morero began to hit him in the skull with a flashlight. And I actually forgot to say this, but this is pertinent. Morero is actually a Cuban American. And at the time when this happened, Cuban-American flares of anger, disgust also came into the fact, saying that that the white man was trying to put down the Cuban, and so that also caused some racial tension in that regard, which is important when we continue on to more abstract matters. Officer Meyer stated that the high-speed chase had slowed down to 25 miles an hour before he surrendered, and that effectively 3 to 8 officers pulled off McDuffie's helmet and proceeded to beat him to death with nightsticks and flashlights. Del Toro was acquitted on May 8th because Judge Nesbitt said the state had failed to prove any case against them, and then the rest of them were acquitted on May 17th by the jury. This did not go very well. It was seen as complete and utter travesty through the news, media, and more close to home through vast rioting. So, I have a Marcus Garvey quote here. No sensible person objects to any man boasting, booming, and advertising the worker cause that he represents. The old adage still applies. He who in this world would rise must fill his bills and advertise. The riots initially were a sense of disgust from the local black population, and they were indicating their anger, their disgust, was with more numbers, fortunately. So the riot started in front of the Metro Justice Building, and from there, 3 lives were claimed and 23 were injured. In fact, this moved out to Liberty City, and Liberty City basically exploded because a white student hit a black child with his car, and street justice ensued, and everyone started torching everything. The riots lasted for 3 days, over $100 million in damages, 18 people died, and the most damage was caused in local black neighborhoods of the rioters. And because of the damages and all the violence, the large chain stores, we're talking Sears, Macy's, JCPenney, didn't come back. 3,000 National Guardsmen were sent down to the area to take control, and a curfew was instilled, and a state of emergency was declared. So what is the rule of law having to do with this? So, we're talking about Mr. Dicey. He stated that law is a constraint on government. The rule of law not only limits the arbitrariness of the government, it also makes the government more intelligent and articulate in its decision making. The question then arises, where you had certain forms of evidence, where you had we have certain forms of evidence. Really, what you're asking is, what was the purpose of the trial if justice was not to be done? The actions of the police themselves were arbitrary to the rule of law, and in fact, the rioters, in response to that, being that the government is comprised of the people, was also not exactly up to par with the rule of law. It's more of a civic responsibility. So you can go to the next slide if you like. So the rule of law and economic development. So before I get to Garvey's theory on ethnocentric economic development, I found this really interesting article by Moses Boyorugana, and it's the rule of law as predominant factor for economic development in Uganda. And what he was talking about is effectively that when you have actors in the system, all actors need to be de jure and de facto secure in order to properly engage in economically beneficial development. Or as Alan Greenspan had put it, people need the legal protection to own and dispose of property without the threat of arbitrary confiscation or mobs in the street. So it goes 2 ways. Social upheaval in a system will inevitably lead to slowed or ceased economic activity, and unstable markets are not ideal for investments for cost-benefit calculations swayed towards high risk and low gain. So basically, without a stable social component, which is supported by law, a system cannot create and increase and engage a middle class to support the local economy with capital necessary to help it flourish. And the rule of law calls for all citizens of all shapes and sizes, and by color of title, the man on the street to be accountable for the laws of their country and respect the rights of others. And so basically, beneficial economic practices arise in a system where under the rule of law, the government is prevented from stultifying individual efforts by ad hoc action, which I believe the trial in this situation was. So Garvey is a very dynamic character, and he has many different theories and ideas of Afrocentrism. And this is part of his poem, A Black Man's Speech to a White Man in America. You kick me down and lash me on my back, and when I cry there's one more whack. But one good day will surely come for me, when God of men will speak to thee, and then the awful thunderclap will tell how far down you will be in hell. And now, I don't actually see this as, I see this as, more of a statement, more of a poetic statement of saying, we are as good as you, we are equal, and we should be treated fairly. And effectively, that was the entire question in this riot. We were not treated fairly, but there was problems in this, and then the reaction doesn't necessarily go in accordance with Garvey's economic model. As a race, we want the higher success as within humanity's grasp. We must therefore reach out and get it. Don't expect others to pave the way for us towards it with a pathway of roses. Go at it what we want, in a will that we will be able to successfully outdo our rivals because we will be expecting them to help us. So effectively, we must work from the bottom, and we must work and fight, and we shall do a good job, and we have to be self-dependent in when we do things. It's very self-determinant. And be not deceived. Wealth is strength, wealth is power, wealth is influence, wealth is justice, is liberty, is real human rights. So part of the Garvey economic model is saying that where we have economic equality, we also will have legal equality, because that is how we can factor into this system. So, fundamentals of Garvey's ethnocentric economic theory is that African Americans were universally oppressed, and any program of emancipation would have to be built around the question of race. And such emancipation also included in their economic posture. And so, basically, black-owned businesses that will serve the black community and make the black community stronger, and will make the black community more wealthy, and also increase into their political abilities. So once a strong economic base is constructed, African Americans can seek other political and social objectives that no longer have to do with the question of capital or influence. So material achievements earned through the entrepreneurial effort would enable African Americans to become equally recognized. So we're looking at racial independence and self-reliance here. So in this situation where African Americans were faced with enormous, enormous economic superiority here, you had to build a solid industrial foundation and then follow upon your successes to allow yourself a racial self-determination. So, continuing on the fundamentals. Commerce and industry are the props of the economic life of the state, communities, and society, and so nations that indulge in commerce and industry are progressive nations. So the idea is to move away from the agrarian, because it's more seen as a self-supporting issue. And I also believe that was a commentary that Garvey had towards Washington. And so economics provide jobs and occupations for residents, and you're either an employee, an employer, or a ward of the state. A person without their own business or specialized training is disadvantaged. So the idea is to remove yourself from ward of state, from employee, and to become the employer in this situation. So it's a bottom-up approach, as I previously stated, so you're seeking. So basically, if you start from the top, you're only going to fall back down to the bottom. And capitalism is necessary for the process of human advancement at this time. And so the idea, and the way that we would work in this situation, as Garvey would say, is that we should have collective decision-making and group profit sharing to help facilitate common African-American economic growth, so that way everybody is interested in progressing forward with limited shares, so that there's also a sense of equality, building up your middle class to get more foundation there, and then also increasing your ability to become more independent and more available to influence the socio-political structures. So, back to the riots. So never approach anybody that you want to get anything out of or any good results from in an offensive manner. To the contrary, with them, with the perfect style, the idea is to make friends and get results. So what happened in the situation with the riots is we have a lot of people who are very, very angry. And the reason why this quotation is here is effectively to show that even though you are angry, even within the Garvey-centric model, the idea is to retaliate through development. It's not the idea to retaliate through violence. Because violence doesn't get you anywhere. Violence brings you back to a point where you had started that you no longer wish to have in the first place. And the images are here basically to show the negative points here. We're not going to see anything prior to this. When I do research on Liberty City, I don't see anything past pictures and images of this. We don't talk about the progressive nature of society up until this point. We get to see this, and this is an adverse image, which should not be the case, especially under Garvey's models. So I found two quotations of people who were actually contemporaries to the 1980 riots. And the first one is, I have to admit, when I saw people taking the streets holding up black power fists in the air, I got excited. It seemed like we were uniting as a people, showing the world we weren't going to be treated like second-class citizens anymore. And then the comment to that was, it was black people hurting themselves, we ruined our neighborhood. So, here's another interesting question of, again, in the political cartoon. Tell me again why we burned down all these businesses. Because of jobs, man, we need jobs. So, a little early, that's okay. I like your finger. That's all right. So effectively what it's saying is, Garvey supports constructive advancement and not going backwards by ruining your own infrastructure to prevent you from making income to support yourself. Since then, there's been a lot of issues in the area, and it's starting to slowly come back in patches, the economic revivalism. But for the riots, I'm certain that we would be at a better position and posture right now. So I have some observations. The Garvey ethnocentric economic model is effective, where actors first seek to establish a base level concurrent businesses and then to increase their horizontal and eventual vertical control of market share and loyalties throughout their demographic. Basically saying, we need to establish ourselves, and from establishing ourselves, we will grow our own brand strength, however that may be, and through the growing of loyalties and our brand strength, then we'll also grow collectively. The effectiveness of the foundation of a localized ethnocentric economic model can be evaluated by the response of the actors within the system in coping and adjusting to both internal and external stressors and their direct and indirect effects upon their economic market and infrastructure. So in this situation, we had a bad trial decision, and in response we had a riot. What we're talking about here is there's two different types of decentralization. We have the rule of law decentralization on one half that has to do with the judiciary, and we have another rule of law decentralization that came from the other side. When those combined, it completely unsettled the economic sphere in that region, and the market basically collapsed on itself. So one of the limitations I did find for the Marcus Garvey model is that it doesn't seem to consider racial pluralities, because another factor would be the Cuban population and the entry into the economic market there, and then also the development of globalization, where we're all expected to kind of get along and to do things that are beneficial in a capitalistic sense. But then again, Garvey predates these considerations. His ideas were more or less focusing on more of a two-party kind of system where you had a majority and a minority. And also I noticed that the Garvey model is not uniquely Afrocentric, and is actually, the strategy may be implemented by any demographic, which is isolationism to a certain effect, which the United States used to its benefit to actually raise to the place where it is. So it does work if done correctly and collectively. And then another thing I thought was very important is that segregation of racial groups may lead to communicative and economic breakdown, where the actions of one group may lead to the exponential losses of both tangible and intangible assets of capital. So basically what it's saying is, where there is subjugation, there is no cooperation, there's no synergy, and without synergy, the entire idea of assimilation, the idea of society breaks down. And so it's not an Afrocentric issue, it's more of a societal question of how we should be treating each other and how we should deal with each other. So that is my presentation. Thank you.
Very, very fine presentation. Thank you very much, Mr. Knapp.
Professor Rowe, I have a comment on the McDuffie riots.
Yes,
Very
okay,
quickly.
go ahead.
No, it's a really dear subject to my heart, because my church was found in the middle of that, and my father became the pastor of our church as a result of McDuffie riots, because the senior pastor of our church is one of the 18 people that died in the riots, because he went to the church that night when there was a curfew, because everything was blowing up around the church, to secure the property to see what was going on, and the police shot him, saying that he was looting. So his wife eventually filed a lawsuit and this whole thing, but he passed away that night. And I remember this whole thing vividly, because, I was a little baby at the time, but we're all playmates with his kids. And this thing was, the McDuffie riots, if you were in Miami at the time, it was horrible. Literally everything shut down.
Yes, it was a terrible time. I mean, coming from the Caribbean, I thought that people didn't behave badly in America. And I saw that people were just as riotous in America as they are in Jamaica. Just as a comment, I think more than 18 people died.
That was the recorded.
I was very, very surprised that more than 18 people died.
There's several seriously injured, but that was the number I got from several sources.
It was a tremendous event, because not right in the middle of the city. It cut off everything. There was no school, no work, no nothing. And you could see and smell the whole city on fire from every single point of view county. It was really a very significant event. Okay. Well, Mr. Everett is going to make a few misrepresentations about me. I will say a few words.
Whose rum punch is up here? It's been half drank. Might finish it.
Your rum punch.
I did the rum punch before Mr. Neff's presentation.
All right, well, man who needs no introduction, Professor Rowe. He is best known as being the co-host of the famous Caribbean Law TV show. I, of course, am his better-looking counterpart on the show. As we all know, Professor Rowe was born in Jamaica. And he was born to the famous Judge Ira Rowe. We got his book earlier, and we've all read that. And Professor Rowe came to the University of Miami School of Law in 1982. However, before his matriculation, he was also a Rhodes finalist from the University of West Indies in both 1980 and 1981. Rowe was a member of the Florida Bar and the Jamaican Bar. He began his career here in Miami after graduation at Greenberg Trari in 1982 and worked there until 1984, where he was then hired by Holland & Knight, two small boutique firms here in the local Miami area. At Greenberg, he was able to work with the former ambassador Amber Moss and Reuben Askew, and at Holland & Knight, he worked with the former American Bar Association president Chesterfield Smith. In 1991, he opened his own firm and has since been just as successful in notable cases such as the United States versus Joel Powell, United States versus Hargitay, and State of Florida v. Lucille Sett, State of Florida versus Sean Perry. Professor Rowe also, as we all learned, the first of the year in 2011, Paige can tell us more about this. He represented Beanie Man. Paige, you knew this though coming into class, and that's why she signed up for the course at first. After Mr. Davis, Beanie Man his visa was canceled by the United States Consulate in Jamaica. Also, Professor Rowe, aside from his time he devotes every Thursday night here, is an expert witness in U.S. federal court on Jamaican political and legal issues. It has been a tremendous semester for all of us. We're so glad to have him, and we get to drink rum at the end of the year, and looking forward to another great semester next year. So without any further ado, Professor Rowe, take it away.
Thank you very much. Well, I don't have a PowerPoint, but I did want to make a few comments. Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey, his ideas continue to lift us all at this time, more than 60 years after his death. A black man born in rural Jamaica in St. Anne, one of or two of 11 children who survived into adulthood. This fascinating individual went to England and developed a love for the English language prior to coming to the United States when he was 29 years old. He only had two core ideas, but he was able to develop a philosophy around those two ideas that has fundamentally influenced millions of people. His first idea was equality of human beings. His second idea was for blacks or Africans to unite and improve their lot. And Mr. Neff has given you a very adroit economic explanation of the coherency of the second idea. But on those two ideas, Garveyism is built. And those two ideas, expressed in different forms and at different times, fundamentally influenced the 20th century. Figures such as David Balfour, David Ben-Gurion of Israel, as a result of the Balfour Declaration, Mohandas Gandhi of India, Norman Manley of Jamaica, Maurice Bishop of Grenada, all took their specific influence from Garvey. In the 1960s, the Commonwealth Caribbean nations, built on the sophisticated bedrock of the reception of English law, sought to obtain independence from their colonial masters, not because they were being administratively mismanaged, but because they deemed that they should be able to manage their own affairs. They thought that they were equal to the job. And again, that is the essence of Garveyism, a seal for self-management or self-determination. This constitutional development has led to the evolution of the independence constitutions of the Caribbean. But none of the Caribbean nations would have been independent today had they not been instigated by Garvey's thoughts. And of course, it is the Caribbean constitutions that have given birth to Caribbean law as we know it today. It must be said that it was the freedom of expression granted by the United States Constitution that protected Garvey's theoretical development, kept his political organization, the UNIA, active, and preserved his heritage. Jamaica has now made him a national hero. And his comments about equality and about self-reliance are significant. I'll select one which I sometimes commend to law students. If you haven't confidence in yourself, you are twice defeated in the race of life. With confidence, you have won even before you have started. Jamaica and Caribbean people have not yet developed the confidence to achieve the economic independence that Garvey fought for in his Black Star Line. Unfortunately, black people in Jamaica and in the general Caribbean still seek economic empowerment. They control only about 9% of the capital assets of the countries that are supposedly independent. Yet, Dice's rule of law obtains, but will it continue to obtain in territories without black economic empowerment? That is why Garvey is very important, because it is hoped that that empowerment will be able to be achieved without the violence of the McDuffie riots. It is hoped that the empowerment will be achieved through the peaceful struggle that Garvey recommended. Marcus Garvey, I think, the most influential man of the 20th century. Thank you very much.
I apologize for my informal dress. It just kind of forced upon me at the last moment. But I'm going to introduce Nyla Harrison.
And she's right here. Nyla is a first-generation American-born to Jamaican parents, and she did graduate from Florida State University with a degree in international affairs at the undergraduate and graduate level. She also then worked as a city planner in the city of Tamarack, which is in Broward County, and she managed the growth and development for the compliance with the city codes of ordinances. After that, she attended UM Law School, where she recently graduated this past May. And while here, she worked at the immigration clinic, where she successfully represented 2 individuals who were under threat to be removed from the country. And she, through her efforts, they were able to stay here with their families. And she was also the vice president of the Association of the Caribbean Law Students here at school. And she's currently an adjunct professor of criminal law at Miami-Dade College. Now, Nyla is also currently co-authoring a book with Professor Rowe on the constitutional history of Jamaica. And this book is going to deal with the outgrowth of the topics explored throughout our Caribbean Law course. So, here's Ms. Nyla Harrison.
Superb.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Tommy. And also thank you, Professor Rowe, for inviting me here to speak this evening. So tonight I will be speaking about the Right Honorable Marcus Garvey and his relevance to modern America and also modern Jamaica. And those are the 2 places where he had the greatest ties. But to be fair, we could speak about Marcus Garvey's relevance in any country in which Black people reside. After all, he did create a global network with his UNIA. And that organization, as you've heard this evening, sought to uplift and unite Africans at home and abroad. The ideals and goals that he advanced while he was alive are recurring themes that seem to appear, as I said before, in just about any place where Black people reside. From Europe to Africa, also those parts of Latin America and Central America with pockets of Black people, for example, Brazil, Costa Rica, and of course the United States. So Garvey truly is relevant everywhere and for all times. Curiously though, Marcus Garvey has not been given the respect, honor, and attention that he deserves. That he's been overlooked in the United States is perhaps not completely surprising, given the fact that he was convicted of mail fraud by a U.S. court. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, deported back to his home country, Jamaica, denounced for his socio-political beliefs, and pursued relentlessly by J. Edgar Hoover, who at the time was the FBI's expert on radical organizations, and who seemed to carry a personal vendetta against him. All in all, Marcus Garvey suffered considerably at the hands of the United States government. He was born in Jamaica, but he achieved maturity in political thought as a member of the Harlem Renaissance, which for the most part took place between 1920 and 1935 in Harlem in the United States. There he honed his public speaking and his writing skills during the time that he spent here in the United States. When Marcus Garvey was deported to Jamaica on December 2nd, 1927, he immediately set about finding a way to achieve political deliverance for the people of Jamaica. And he founded the People's Political Party, the PPP, on September 29, 1929 in Kingston, Jamaica. And that was nearly 10 years before any other political party had been formed on the island. Now, the People's National Party, the PNP, founded by Norman Manley in 1938, and the Jamaica Labour Party, founded by his cousin Alexander Bustamante, who ended up being the first Prime Minister of Jamaica, founded in 1943, are 2 of the contending political parties in Jamaica currently. Although Marcus Garvey's PPP is still active in Jamaica and did participate in the most recent elections in December 2011, no members managed to win any of the seats, but the organization still exists. Garvey was a forerunner, he was a forward thinker in demanding political independence in Jamaica. He absolutely influenced both Manley and Bustamante
who were initially labor activists, fighting for better wages for workers and other concessions that would improve the day-to-day living and working conditions for Jamaicans. But Marcus Garvey's vision of a better Jamaica for his black brothers was really based on a long-term overhaul of the political state of affairs. So prior to the PPP's founding, Manly and Bustamante had only considered socio-economic change and not necessarily political change on such a grand scale. When Marcus Garvey founded the PPP, he outlined a 26-point manifesto, and I'll note the most salient points that I think are most important. So the first was self-government, and remember that this was before any other political parties had mentioned it. So self-government, a minimum wage, an 8-hour working day, land reform, judicial reform for tougher sanctions on judges who perverted justice or somehow contravened the law or were not entirely unbiased. Also a Jamaican university and a polytechnic school, free secondary education for all Jamaicans, a public library in every parish, an academy for music and art, prison reform, an office for legal aid for indigent people, strong voter intimidation legislation, which would also include jail time, and a rural health care system. So those were some of the more salient points included in his early manifesto. Now, Marcus Garvey's call for an independent Jamaica is still relevant today as the country considers removing Queen Elizabeth II as the head of state and transitioning Jamaica to a republic state. The Jamaican Prime Minister, Portia Simpson Miller, has expressed her commitment to severing ties with the former colonial head. And if this happens, then Jamaica would not only achieve complete political independence, but also the oversight of the Privy Council as the highest court of appeal would more than likely move to the Caribbean Court of Justice as part of the regional body, CARICOM, which is short for Caribbean Community and Common Market. Now, if Marcus Garvey were here today, then he would probably be very displeased to know that the Privy Council was still sitting all the way in London and making important judicial decisions for and on behalf of Jamaicans when they are perfectly capable of doing so themselves. Garvey was also in favor of the Caribbean Federation, which did fail, and so he would probably support today an integration of a regional court system to deal with appeals. And the Caribbean Court of Justice is properly suited to hear cases because of the expertise of the judiciary. They are highly skilled and highly trained in their legal thinking. Also, the proximity to the jurisdiction and the shared heritage among all of the Caribbean countries. So, having been arrested arbitrarily on a number of occasions, having been generally harassed and wrongly convicted, Marcus Garvey was very committed and particularly in tune to ensuring fair and just legal processes for black people both in Jamaica and in the United States. The need for judicial reform, for prison reform, for legal aid, also for stronger legislation and voter intimidation, as you saw in his manifesto, shows his commitment to upholding legal rights in addition to those social, economic, and political changes that he fought for. In the United States, he fought against lynching and the denial of due process for American blacks. The 1964 Civil Rights Act and also the Voting Rights Act are indirect products of Marcus Garvey's work during the 1920s when he was here in the United States. He theorized that blacks would never achieve justice in the United States of America, and hence his Back to Africa movement. He did, however, regard the black American experience as different from the black Jamaican experience. He, in fact, was adamant that Africa was for the Africans and that repatriation was a must, although he seemed to make some kind of an exception for Jamaica. And you can see that in the first point of his manifesto, where he called for self-governance of Jamaica by Jamaicans. And that idea perhaps is different because Jamaica is a homogeneously black nation for the most part. And so they could achieve the kind of self-determination that he preached about, whereas that might be more difficult in the United States. Difficult or nearly impossible. Black people in the United States have achieved much since the time that Marcus Garvey was expelled from the country. And on November 4th, 2008, a miraculous thing happened, which for the most part was unprecedented, although Jesse Jackson did make a run for the White House in 1984 and 1988. But on November 4th, 2008, the United States of America elected its first black president. And I would have to think, and many would agree, that Marcus Garvey would have been astonished. He would have been a very, very proud black man. But it's not entirely clear that the election of a black president would have pacified him. Marcus Garvey was the first black nationalist, and there's never really been anyone quite like him. No one has made such radical declarations, if you consider repatriation to be radical, except perhaps for Rastafarians in Jamaica, and now all over the world who regard Marcus Garvey as a prophet and also embrace the idea of repatriation. Malcolm X does come close. He, like Garvey, believed in separation rather than integration. But to distinguish, we do have Martin Luther King and many of the other civil rights leaders who fought for civil rights for blacks in America and were successful. But Martin Luther King never really considered repatriation. He wanted to work with America to be included and to be treated as an American like everyone else. He never considered leaving the country that had systematically discriminated and abused black people. So while Marcus Garvey, I think, would support the achievement of a black man in the highest office, he would probably today still be vehemently opposed to the continued acculturation and assimilation of his people into white America. Garvey said, "Man, know thyself," and that's a direct quote. And by that he meant, look within yourself for redemption, not to others. So the idea of working with the United States, trying to become a part, was not something that Garvey would have been in favor of. To distinguish, where President Barack Obama stands for a united America, Marcus Garvey today might be described as divisive. He did not necessarily believe that black people could have a viable future in the United States. He said their place was back in Africa. So just on a final note today, as I was preparing this talk, I called and I spoke with Jeffrey Phillip. He's a Jamaican writer, poet, and playwright. And more recently, he's the individual who has taken up the task of seeking full exoneration of Marcus Garvey from President Obama. And I asked him the same question that I was posed with today about Garvey's relevance. And he said that it came down to a single word, which was respect. The acronym, he said respect was an acronym, and he broke it down as follows: redemption, education, self-reliance, purpose, entrepreneurship, community, and tradition. So Garvey today doesn't necessarily need to be relevant for his Back to Africa charge if you think it too radical, but respect as it was broken down should be on everyone's minds. It can be on everyone's minds as something of an inner philosophy that's simply borrowed from Garvey's teachings. So if you identify with Garvey's ideals and you believe he was wrongly convicted, then I would encourage you to sign the petition for exoneration. It's available online. Thank you.
Are you prepared to take questions?
Absolutely.
Anybody? I have one. Anybody else want to ask Ms. Harrison any questions about the presentation? Well, I wanted to ask, do you think that Garvey drew a distinction between, we knew that he considered America the modern Babylon from which to the deliverance. Do you think that he considered Jamaica a modern Babylon also? I mean, at the time that he was politically active in Jamaica, and still today, black people still are not in a position of economic empowerment. So does that mean that black people should stay in Jamaica and fight for empowerment, or do they go back to Africa? What's your view of Garvey's position on that?
Well, as I stated in the presentation, I think he did regard the black American experience as different from the black Jamaican experience. And in the manifesto where he outlined, as he founded the PPP, that self-determination or self-government in Jamaica was a possibility. So that is the platform that he ran on. I think because Jamaica, if it were actually to be administrative and completely politically independent, then as a black nation, that might be sufficient for Garvey. So, and there would be no need for Jamaicans to go back.
But many of his objectives, say the university, the library, the funded rural hospitals, and many of those things are current programs of modern Jamaican governments. So to a certain extent, he was philosophically many, many decades ahead of independent Jamaica. Okay, any other questions for Saracen?
There's been this resurgence of interest in Marcus Garvey recently. Why would you say that is? What has prompted this resurgence in the interest of Marcus Garvey?
Yeah, there has been, and he's been rehabilitated. And why is that?
Well, he has been, and one of the things with the exoneration project is because in the United States and to a lesser degree in Jamaica as well, Garvey is not necessarily taught the way that some of the other black leaders are taught, and he's not put on the sort of pedestal that he should be. So the idea is that with exoneration, there will be a redemption of Marcus Garvey's name, and the ideals that he stood for.
Do you think that if we were to not necessarily the same rhetoric or the same black nationalist ideal that Garvey espoused in terms of strengthening CARICOM or things that or organizations that are in the same realm of trying to unify pretty much a region of people, do you think that that would lend support to the whole idea of a CARICOM or something similar to a CARICOM? Or do you think that would be a distraction, or should we just focus on just the economics of the situation? Which is what I think is happening now. I think it's just a purely economic issue, and it just makes sense economically, and it's not even looked at as this makes sense from a Garvey point of view as well.
Well, I think when you talk about CARICOM, because you have economics in the common market, and then you also have bringing in the judiciary with the Caribbean Court of Justice. I think that's how you get the greatest integration, and that's something that Garvey would have wanted to see.
It was about unity and about cooperation and about institutional cooperation among black people.
Right.
Well, all people, but I mean, certainly among black people. So I think he would have supported CARICOM. So interesting. Your juxtaposition of the question of the rejection or the evolution, the constitutional evolution towards the republic and Garveyism is very interesting. What was Garvey's position with respect to the sovereign? I mean, you have different views on that. Was he pro-UK sovereign? I mean, I was told once that the reason that he put God Save the Queen on his poster was because he didn't want to be arrested for treason. But he really was against the whole concept of a British sovereign.
That's right.
Is that your understanding?
I would say so, and I believe Neff showed in his PowerPoint, and he mentioned that it was better to smile with their enemies rather than antagonize them. So that's something, Marcus Garvey was not a violent man, he was intelligent, and he surely would have used those kinds of tactics to get his point across. So God Save the Queen would have been one of them.
Okay, well, thank you very much. To finish everything, Ms. Reese.
Introduction to Caribbean Law class, would like to thank everyone this evening for coming. We'd especially like to thank Professor Rowe and our speaker, Ms. Harrison. Also, thank you to all my classmates who gave presentations. Also especially to you, Professor Rowe, for taking this group of 7 students and really turning us into mini Caribbean Law scholars. Hope to everyone who will be taking Caribbean Law too that we have the same incredible experience that we did this semester. So thank you very much, Professor Rowe, and thank you again everyone for coming this evening.